Very happy to be here. In some regard, my presentation is somewhat of integration of the last two presentations between Kabbalah and somewhat of German philosophy, but this time in Eastern Europe at the start of the 20th century. And to start it, I want to tell you about a man, but obviously much less famous, certainly from Franz Rosenzweig and others. So I want to start by telling you about a man named Rabbi Shem Tov Geffen. Geffen was born in 1856 in what is nowadays Ukraine, before moving to Palestine and teaching at Rav Kook's yeshiva in Jaffa. When he was 19, Rabbi Geffen saw a solar eclipse for the first time, and he stared directly into the sun. Naturally, his eyes hurt, and his vision became blurry, and he lay down in bed trying to recover, and then he had a vision. In this vision, he felt that existence was much wider and richer than usual, and he walked around in existence with infinite dimensions. And he sensed these infinite dimensions, both spiritually and physically. From that day on, Geffen attempted to prove both mathematically and philosophically the existence of additional dimensions of reality. By proving that, he hoped to also prove the possibility of prophecy and to attain its renewal. The extra dimensions were obvious to him, not only from his vision, but also from Kabbalistic and Hasidic books with which he grew up. In his books and articles, the reader finds not just strange equations, as I said, tried to prove it mathematically, but also original, if slightly odd, metaphysics. All of this is accompanied by references to the Zohar and the Book of Raziel. When I first came across these books and articles, I asked myself, what is happening here? What was the cultural and intellectual context of this corpus, which combines philosophy and mathematics, and which intended to attain a mystical goal, that is, the renewal of prophecy? What I have found is a group of Kabbalists from Lithuanian rabbinic backgrounds operating at the early 20th century in Palestine and Eastern Europe, for whom it was important to integrate secular knowledge, such as mathematics, philosophy, and the sciences, with their Kabbalistic ideas. The most famous figure in that group is Rabbi Icchaka Cook, to whose name we may add those of his most less known associates, Shem Tov Geffen, as I said, Pinchas Lintop, Shmuel Alexandrov, David Cohen, also known as Hanazir, and among others. In the short time that I have, I will try to give you a small taste of this fascinating world. I will focus on one theme in that rich world, the combination of Kabbalah with Neo-Kantian and German idealist ideas. I want to quickly give you two examples of this phenomenon in the context of the intellectual climate in which 20th century East European Kabbalistic thought took shape. As we will see, I believe that the confrontation with positivism and materialism had a prominent role in molding that Kabbalistic discourse. And you'll excuse me for stressing regarding positivism and materialism as a whole, even though it is not, because for them, which they are much less philosophical, accurate understanding, if you will, it's all the same philosophical threads. So, the first example of this integration is, the first example is the integration of the concept of Sephirot with Kant's metaphysics, i.e., the distinction between the phenomenal world and the neomnon, or the thing in itself. Perhaps we should not be surprised that Kabbalists were attracted to this type of thinking by virtue of the fact that it leaves a world full of mystery beyond the bonds of human intellectual perception. We would, perhaps, be more surprised to discover that Kant's distinction helped Rav Kook to reinterpret the meaning of Kabbalistic chains of emanations, the Sefirot, and perhaps even more surprised to discover that, in Rav Kook's opinion, that this distinction was not even Kant's innovation. Kabbalistic tradition knew this all along. Or in Rav Kook's word, in a letter to Shmuel Alexandrov from 1907, and I quote, אמת הדבר, שמאז ומעולם ידענו, ולא הצלחנו לקאנט שיגלה לנו רז זה, שכל ההכרות האנושיות הינן סובייקטיביות ייחוסיות. זאת היא המלכות, מבחינת כלי דלת לה מגרמה כלום. Or in English, and I quote, the truth is that we have always known this, and we did not need Kant to reveal this secret to us, that all human perception are subjective and relative, for this is malchut, in its aspect of being a vessel which has nothing of its own. End of quote. According to Rav Kook's theory, the Sefirah of Malchut is perception itself. It is the screen on which all the shades and colors of the phenomenal world are reflected. If we understand the partial nature of this perspective, if we understand the limitations of human perception, then, perhaps, we will be able to comprehend something of the incomprehensible existence of God. This, according to Rav Kook, is the union of Keter, the highest Sephirah, and Malchut, the lowest Sephirah. The union of the I, Ani, and the divine nothingness, I. Human perception is aware of its limitations and thus perceives something of the nothingness which it is unable to comprehend. In Rav Kook's opinion, the understanding that God exists but is at the same time incomprehensible directs our attention to the Sefirot, that is, to the partial revelations of God in the world. He emphasizes that they are expressions of God from which flow all that is good and moral, but they are not total revelations of God. This, in Rav Kook's opinion, is what distinguishes Jewish thought from the thought of other religions and from the thought of Spinoza, which the essays that I'm talking about is part of criticism of Spinoza, and, well, in some way through Spinoza I criticize materialism. No, besides the point. I'm sorry. Kook here combined a number of ideas from the Kabbalistic tradition, including from the thought of the 14th century Spanish Kabbalist, Yosef Jikatilia, and the founder of Chabad Hasidism, Shneur Zalman of Liadi. But another important influence on the formation of these ideas was the German Jewish neo-Kantian philosopher Hermann Cohen. To be precise, Kook was influenced by a lecture of Cohen's which was published as an article in the journal Hashiloach in 1904. In a letter which Kook's son, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, sent to the Hebrew writer Yosef Chaim Brenner, he claimed that this Kook's theory needed to be seen as a response to Cohen's lecture from Hashiloach. The theory was published in a tract named Ikve Atzon in 1907. In the lecture of Cohen in Hashiloach, Cohen explained his conception of Judaism as a religion of ethics, with no mythological element, whose concept of God had solely ethical content. For, and I quote from Cohen, one should only discuss the concept of God in its special forms with which it continually reveals itself. End of quote. There is a great distance between the ideas of Rav Kook and those of Hermann Cohen. And of course, Kook's acquaintance with German philosophy didn't come only from this one article. But Kook never read Kant in the original. He encountered popular presentations of philosophy by his contemporaries in periodicals and other popular works. And still, it is hard to ignore the fact that the central principle of Cohen's lecture is also the central idea in Cook's essays. That is, that any discussion of the concept of God must be focused on the ways in which God is reflected in the human perception and on the ethical implications of these revelations. So, this is my first example to the way in which Neo-Kantian philosophy influenced the formation of the 20th century Kabbalah. It reflects the importance of popular publications like HaShiloach for understanding the intellectual background in which modern Kabbalah was formed. The second theme, which I want to touch on, relates to metaphysical voluntarism. Arthur Schopenhauer claimed that the noumenon appears first and foremost as a will, as a blind impulse to exist, as we heard earlier. Kabbalists like Rav Kook and Shmuel Alexandrov gathered from this thought that behind all phenomena of reality there stands a single transcendent will, the will of God. Shalom Rosenberg has shown that this understanding of the world as will with divine origin is among the building blocks in Rav Kook's philosophy. But I want to leave Rav Kook aside and turn to another thinker, Shmuel Alexandrov. Alexandrov is a slightly obscure thinker, but fascinating and exceptional nevertheless. He was contemporary of Rav Kook and corresponded with him for several years. He will help us to expand our point of view and to see that we are not talking only about Rav Kook, but about a group of Kabbalists, as I said earlier. Alexandrov explained his Kabbalistic voluntarism, if you will, in a private correspondence with a man named Eliezer Yitzhak Sheinbaum. Sheinbaum was a philosopher who wrote an original work of epistemology in Hebrew. That is to say, he composed a popular philosophical tract of the type we mentioned above, from which Kabbalists like Rav Kook and Alexandrov drew. Sheinbaum and Alexandrov, in their correspondence, discussed Sheinbaum's magnum opus, the foundation of existence and perception, in which Sheinbaum presented his version of metaphysical voluntarism. He claimed that all the wills which compose the world are parts of a transcendental will, which aspires to recognize itself and to realize itself. In those two aspects, self-recognition and self-realization, Sheinbaum distinguished himself from both Schopenhauer and Hartmann. Alexandrov combined this type of voluntarist philosophy with ideas from Chabad Hasidism, and quoted Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, Hillel of Paris, and Aaron of Strasilia, in order to show that they too had a certain understanding of metaphysical voluntarism. A central component of this voluntarism is the unity of all wills in the divine will. What distinguishes the Kabbalists from the philosophers, in Alexandrov's opinion, is the method through which they reach their conclusions. Philosophy uses rational, discursive intellect. In contrast, the Kabbalists reached their conclusions through religious tradition and intuition. The power of tradition and intuition is that they allow this knowledge, which for philosopher remains only theoretical, to Alexandrov's opinion, of course, to be internalized. Thus, in Alexandrov's opinion, only Kabbalah can inculcate the thought that the whole existence, including animals and inanimate objects, is pulsating with divine forces. Even the inanimate is in many senses alive, desirous, and divine. But why is this important? Why is it important for Alexandrov to live in a world which even objects desire and know, in which the inanimate has a divine quality? Well, for similar reasons to Sheinbaum, to answer the challenge of positivism and materialism. At the beginning of the 20th century, positivist discourse was at the height of its power. It described a secular, mechanic world, empty of heavenly forces and metaphysical entities. as we will soon be able to read in Eli Stern's book, named Jewish Materialism, materialist discourse was gaining great popularity in this period, not only in Yiddish and Russian Jewish intelligentsia, but also in the Hebrew intelligentsia in Eastern Europe as well. Metaphysical voluntarism, translated into Kabbalistic voluntarism, helped Alexandrov cope with this threat by filling the ontological void left by materialism with divine forces and wills. Only, in Alexandrov's opinion, only with Kabbalah tradition and intuition, one can fight the cold rationalistic discourse logic of materialism. Only with Kabbalistic internalization, one can see the divine vitality of the physical world. In conclusion, I presented to you the way in which philosophical ideas influenced the formation of Kabbalistic thought in Eastern Europe in the 20th century. I claimed that we are not talking merely about one thinker or another, but about the trend of Kabbalists with Lithuanian rabbinic background. I claimed that in order to analyze this influence, one needs to examine the cultural climate in which these Kabbalists functioned. The popular philosophical compositions which they used have, more often than not, yet to receive scholarly attention, like Schengom's books and others. One also needs to examine the intellectual motivations of this cultural climate, motivations which were often shared by Kabbalists and other intellectuals of the time. In our case, I tried to show how materialist and positivist discourses drove Kabbalists to become interested in ideas like metaphysical voluntarism, which were formed in opposition to materialist discourse. If you will, this is also what drove Shem-Tov Geffen to pursue a philosophical and mathematical proof of the existence of additional dimensions of existence. Dimensions which exceeded the bounds of rational and scientific perception. Thank you very much.
Any questions, remark? Yeah, please, Pinkas.
If I understand, thank you for your interesting presentation. I have a sort of two questions. I didn't understand exactly how the neo-Kantian ideas came into form. Tell me if I'm right. Did the neo-Kantian idea influence modern Kabbalah and taking a role in the materialistic critique of this Kabbalah? This is been discussed, like how neo-Kantian ethics came into the Kabbalistic literature and being important in maybe in a conceptual way as a critique of materialism. Like, because I understand the first part was a Kant aesthetic, like as I understand, like what is the connection of the Ein Sof, the eternity, and the Das Ding an sich that we don't have access to, the thing for itself. Okay. So this I understand how Kant can affect Kabbalah, and Soloveitchik was already like older.
So I believe we should break it down to different pieces, because maybe I made some connections which I shouldn't have made. First of all, I don't want to talk about Kant. My focus is not Kant, it's neo-Kantianism. So we're talking about Hermann Cohen. And and you're right, and you're right, we should distinguish between the two parts of my lecture. The first part discussed neo-Kantianism, and it actually did not show a critique of materialism. So this is maybe wasn't cleared by me. I just want to show how neo-Kantianism, but not, and that was important, not the original a pure form of neo-Kantianism, which I don't believe that Rav Kook had access to, but a popular form of neo-Kantianism that was imported into the Hebrew discourse of Palestine and Eastern Europe, like this translation or a popular lecture of Hermann Cohen, which appeared in Hashiloach, which we know that was on Rav Kook's mind when he wrote his essays, which I discussed.
But you said those lectures are from 1904, so they belong to the Marbu.
Published in 1904.
Yes, so they are before the Berlin times of Cohen, before the concept of religion. So they refer directly to the neo-Kantian times.
Right.
In that times.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but I don't think that if you ask Rav Kook, even in the 1930s, and you ask him about the different times of Hermann Cohen's thought, I don't think you will know what you're talking about.
Okay, but in 1904,
yes.
Religion of Reason was not written yet, yes?
Right. So I'm talking. That's part of what I tried to say. If we want to understand how neo-Kantianism or Hermann Cohen or any philosophical terms influenced people like Rav Kook, like Alexander, like Gentile Geffen, etc., we should search a popular manifestations of the philosophy and not go necessarily to the German original work, which none of them or most of them did not read. And the second part of what I said doesn't discuss neo-Kantianism, but rather German idealism, and German idealism usually went through a Russian interpretation, mainly religious, Christian Orthodox Russian interpretation, and then it was manifested as a critic of materialism. And we know that a man like Alexandrov discussed the works of Solovyov, which was influenced by German idealism, and this is the way it goes. But Chainboim, for example, read German philosophy, and he used it for his own purposes, which were, again, critical materialism.